Before he was old Tippecanoe, he was a grizzled frontiersman. He was a military hero for early Americans fighting in the Indian Wars, securing more and more land for greedy politicians in Washington, D.C. Before the glitz and glamour of becoming a popular politician, he was a log cabin and hard cider type of guy. And at 68 years old, he becomes the President of the United States of America. Unfortunately, what he'd be best known for was not his feats in the western frontiers, or even his presidency. Rather, it was what happened after his presidency that still affects us all today. Come meet the 9th President of the United States of America, William Henry Harrison. Hey everyone, welcome back to Hobby Teaching. My name's Matt, and I'm a teacher. I love to teach the moments and people of history that I don't always get to talk about in the traditional classroom. So, I created this podcast. Let's go ahead and begin. William Henry Harrison was born February 9th, 1773 to a founding father of the United States, Benjamin Harrison. He was the 7th and youngest child in the family. The Harrison family was a very influential family, considering that his father was a prominent planter in Virginia, a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses, signer of the Declaration of Independence, and a member of the Continental Congress. So, William will be tutored at home until the age of 14, where he will finally be sent off to college, where he will receive a classical education at Hampton-Sydney College. When we think of a classical education, think of a typical liberal arts schooling. Critical thinking, ancient history, Greek or Latin, logic, reasoning, rhetoric, those types of things. Harrison will attend Hampton-Sydney College from 1787 to 1790. Then his father's going to pull him from the college in 1791. Hampton-Sydney College was a Presbyterian college where the family was Episcopalian. So, Benjamin is going to send his son to Philadelphia to be with his brother, but to also study at Penn University under the famed Surgeon General of the Continental Army, Benjamin Rush, who just so happens also to be a founding father and signer of the Declaration of Independence. So, the Harrison family was very well connected. William really wasn't that interested in medicine, and his career as a doctor and medical student will not last long. Soon after, his father is going to pass away in 1791. Because his older brother will inherit most of the family plantation and the money, William will choose to withdraw from Penn and instead enlist in the military. It's claimed that his first act as an enlisted member of the military was to round up all of the thrill-seeking young men in Philadelphia and get them to sign enlistment papers, and then to march them to Fort Washington in Washington, D.C. Later, Harrison will be assigned to Cincinnati in the Northwest Territory, where he will engage in the Northwest Indian War. By 1793, Harrison had worked himself to the rank of lieutenant and was appointed the aide-de-camp to General Mad Anthony Wayne. Aide-de-camp is kind of the personal secretary or assistant to a high-ranking officer. It is viewed as fairly prestigious and a good opportunity for Harrison to continue his career in the military, but also as a social and political jumping point. It's also important to point out that he is the aide-de-camp to one of the most famous generals at the time, Mad Anthony, who was nicknamed this for his bold and daring tactics during the American Revolution. Harrison's military career is going to be fairly prestigious. On August 20th, 1794, he will participate in the Battle of Fallen Timbers, where the battle effectively will end the Northwest Indian War. He is going to exhibit coolness and bravery, riding on horseback from stronghold to stronghold, relaying directives and orders from General Wayne. So much so was he so brave that Harrison will actually receive a commendation from the general saying, quote, who rendered the most essential service, conduct, and bravery, exciting the troops to press for victory, end quote. So Harrison clearly was an important part of this battle, so much so that General Wayne is even going to allow him to sign the treaty as a witness. Harrison will sign the Treaty of Greenville in 1795, which will open 2/3 of Ohio to white settlers. It's also around this time that Harrison will meet his future wife, Anna Tuttle, the daughter of influential judge John Cleves Sims. The judge does not approve of this marriage. When Harrison asks for her hand, he he asks him, "How do you plan to support my daughter? I would much rather her marry a farmer or a lawyer, but definitely not a young soldier." So, William Henry Harrison does what all of us would do. When Judge Sims leaves town, they elope, they get married on November 25th, 1795. When Sims returns, he's not happy at all. He even asks Harrison, "How do you intend to support a family?" And Harrison answers, quote, "By my sword and my own right arm," end quote. That was a pretty good answer. Sims actually enjoyed that answer. It's a bold answer. It's also in reference to the Christian Bible, Psalms 44. And Sims will eventually come around to the idea of William Henry Harrison being good enough for his daughter. Harrison will be promoted to the rank of captain in May of 1797. And then about a year and a month later, on June 1st, 1798, he will resign his role in the military and choose to move to modern-day Ohio, where he will start a farm. Harrison is going to use his connections with Judge Sims and also with his friend Timothy Pickering, the Secretary of State, to receive an appointment as the Secretary of the Northwest Territory, which would include modern-day Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. At this point, he's only 25 years old, and he's going to quickly get bored of his job. Really, he has larger political ambitions. He wants to be in the United States Congress. So he starts working towards that. He starts to build up this rugged frontier reputation. It's great for publicity. He's running a successful horse breeding business. He's making friends with people out on the frontier, but also the American aristocracy in the East. And Congress is super unpopular in the Northwest Territory. They're recently passing laws that raises the price of land. It discourages more people heading west. So Harrison becomes the champion of the people of the Northwest Territory. And this is going to earn him the role of delegate of the Northwest Territory, where he is going to go to Congress and he's going to encourage them to lower the prices of land. He's going to encourage more and more people to move west. Eventually, what he does here will lead to the statehood of Ohio. At 26 years old, William Henry Harrison will then win an election by one singular vote to become the delegate of the Northwest Territory in the 6th United States Congress. As delegate, he does not have the authority to vote on legislation, but he can serve on a committee and he can submit legislation, including debates on the floor, should he wish to participate. He will serve on the Committee of Public Lands, where he's going to push for the Land Act of 1800, which will open the Northwest Territory for small tracts at a lower price with only a 5% down payment. This here is really going to open the door for westward expansion. He's also going to be instrumental in dividing the Northwest Territory into two sections. An eastern section, which would still be called the Northwest Territory, made up of modern-day Ohio and Michigan, and a western section named the Indiana Territory, which would be made up of modern-day Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, western Michigan, and eastern Minnesota. And because of this frontier reputation that he's built and this hard work that he's shown in Congress, on May 23rd, 1800, President John Adams will appoint William Henry Harrison governor of the Indiana Territory. For 12 years, William Henry Harrison will hold this position, being reappointed 3 separate times. And in 1804, after President Thomas Jefferson makes the Louisiana Purchase, William Henry Harrison will be asked to administer the government of the Louisiana Territory for 5 weeks, meaning he held the largest jurisdiction of land for any appointed governor. As governor, Harrison is primarily concerned with obtaining Indian land and encouraging further settlement for Indiana statehood. He still has these personal ambitions of joining the United States Congress and believes if he does a good enough job as an administrator of land, he could easily win an election. Unfortunately, his actions are going to come at the cost of the indigenous Americans in the West. Harrison will ultimately steal millions of acres of land all across Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Missouri. Essentially, he is given full authority to negotiate treaties with the indigenous populations. He will deal swiftly. He will use force when needed, and oftentimes he will offer financial assistance in the form of subsidiaries to chiefs in order to buy the land that don't actually ever make it to the indigenous people. Oftentimes, he would also use alcohol, whiskey, as a bargaining piece to convince chiefs to sell their land for less money than what they were owed. He would pay $1 per 20,000 acres of land, a significant discount to what other people are paying for land. And by the end of his term as governor, it's going to be estimated that nearly 51 million acres of land were taken from the indigenous populations, unnecessarily raising the tensions between Indians and white settlers. Harrison was also pro-slavery. In 1803, he will actually lobby Congress to remove Article 6 from the Northwest Ordinance, which banned slavery from newly acquired land. That article was written by the current sitting president, Thomas Jefferson. Harrison will assert that it's necessary for westward expansion and statehood to have slavery. And this move was deeply, deeply unpopular with Congress and many of the abolitionists in the territory. So when Harrison couldn't get Article 6 removed, he instead turns to his own legislative body of the territory in 1807. Together, they will pass laws allowing indentured servitude, giving masters the authority to determine length of the servitude. Indentured servitude essentially is another form of slavery. A person who wants to move west but doesn't have the money to do so could ask a wealthier person to pay for their trip westward. And in turn, they would pay off their debt by working for this person. Harrison's legislation basically states that the master of the indentured servant could determine however long they want to keep their indentured servant. And a lot of times what that looks like is promising, work for me for 3 years and I'll let you go, but they keep extending it. They keep saying, well, actually, it costs more than that, and with inflation or with the economy doing so poorly, I actually need you for another 2 years. Essentially, what Harrison created was another form of slavery. Once again, not exactly a popular move by Harrison. This was especially unpopular with President Thomas Jefferson. He will actually donate his personal money to churches so that they could move their abolitionist congregations to the Northwest Territory as political opponents of William Henry Harrison. In 1809, the legislative elections are held, and abolitionists win many of the elections. And they set to work immediately removing William Henry Harrison's indentured servant legislation. They will continue to grow more and more power and eventually advance towards statehood, which would leave Harrison powerless as the governor of the territory. In 1810, tensions between the Indians and white settlers is going to reach an all-time high, and not in the least because of Harrison's own doing. The transition between Thomas Jefferson's presidency and James Madison's presidency is going to leave Harrison unchecked to kind of do as he feels when negotiating with the indigenous populations. Indian resistance will grow incredibly strong under the leadership of two Shawnee brothers, Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa. Together, they are going to unite all of the tribes in the territory into one negotiating and fighting force. Tenskwatawa especially is going to be known as the prophet. He believes that the Great Spirit will protect all of the indigenous people and that no harm will befall them in the defense of their land from white settlement. He tells all of the Indians in the land to pay only half of what is owed to white traders, to give up all things considered white or Western, including clothes, muskets, alcohol, whiskey. And this is going to bubble over to the point where Tecumseh, with 400 warriors, are going to meet William Henry Harrison as residents at Grouseland in Indiana, where they are going to argue over the sale of lands. Tecumseh will argue that the Fort Wayne Treaty, which Harrison was the primary architect, was illegitimate because it was done without the consent of all the tribes. Tecumseh gives a speech that lasts over an hour, and his intellect and orating skills rivals William Henry Harrison's education, and not in a good way. It's said that it kind of went over Harrison's head. Harrison was reportedly condescending. He will state that each tribe could sell individual land as they owned it. It wasn't a large communal land that they all had to agree on. He even states that if the Great Spirit wanted all of the Indians to be together as one, then they would all speak the same exact language. This meeting is going to end in a shouting match with weapons drawn. Tecumseh is going to threaten to ally himself with the British and other tribes in the area. If this is going to come to blows, then he will ally himself with all of the people who rival the United States. And eventually it will come to that. This will become known as Tecumseh's War. Filled with political ambitions and a fear of a unified Indian front, Harrison convinces the Secretary of War, William Eustis, to allow him command of an army and to confront Tecumseh. He will even write to Eustis, quote, "The implicit obedience and respect which the followers of Tecumseh pay to him is really astonishing, and more than any other circumstances bespeaks him one of those uncommon geniuses which spring up occasionally to produce revolutions and overturn the established order of things. If it were not for the vicinity of the United States, he would perhaps be the founder of an empire that would rival in glory to Mexico or Peru." Harrison will march 950 soldiers to the Pawnee camp, hoping to intimidate the Indians. Instead, Harrison's arrogance, perhaps, almost costs him the war. He does not fortify his position. He allows campfires at night, which ultimately leads to a surprise attack by the Shawnee warriors who know exactly his location. On November 7th, the Shawnee attack, and this battle will become the Battle of Tippecanoe. With a much larger force and more superior technology, Harrison's group is almost overrun, but he is able to rally them and rout the Pawnee warriors. Casualties were fairly low for the Pawnee, 62 dead and 126 wounded, but the battle will break their spirit to fight. They were told the Great Spirit would protect them and no harm would befall them, but people died in that battle. So they fled. They left the area and they will regroup in Canada. At first, the message Harrison sent back to the Secretary of War makes it sound like he lost. He will later clarify it, but the damage is already done. The Secretary of War is not happy. Why didn't Harrison defend his position better? Why did he allow them to have campfires? Why didn't he fortify his position stronger? Why didn't he choose a better defensive position? It was unnecessary. And this is going to drive a great divide between Harrison and the politics in Washington. So Harrison will join the war effort in the War of 1812 and will serve as Major General in the Kentucky Militia before he'll be appointed to command the Army of the Northwest Territory. Harrison will win two impressive victories for the United States. Firstly, he will recapture Detroit from the British. And then secondly, he will invade Upper Canada, which is modern-day Ontario, and defeat the British Army alongside Tecumseh on October 5th, 1813, at the Battle of the Thames. In United States lore, the Battle of the Thames is probably the most impressive victory during the War of 1812. The only battle that overshadows what Harrison did was the Battle of New Orleans, commanded by future President Andrew Jackson. Nonetheless, Harrison's a war hero. By 1814, Harrison will resign from the Army after the new Secretary of War, John Armstrong, will make the decision to divide Harrison's army, reassign Harrison to an outlying post, and then give a subordinate officer control of the main fighting army. Harrison feels slighted, so he resigns. There is an argument that Harrison's communication and tactics was an issue, and we see that certainly followed him from Tippecanoe. Either way, Harrison resigns and he returns back home to his farm. Back at his farm, Harrison will slowly fall into debt. He is living a life as a celebrity, not a life of responsibility. He is spending a lot of time trying to find a political role through his connections and not really focusing on his frontier duties or his businesses. His horse breeding business is going to fall into shambles. He is catering to the American aristocracy in Washington, D.C. However, in 1816, he will be elected to complete the term of John McLean in the U.S. House of Representatives for Ohio until 1819. During this time, he will also try to secure the post of Secretary of War or diplomat to Russia, but he will be passed over both times. From 1819 to 1821, he was elected to the Ohio Senate. He will also run for the governor of Ohio in 1820 and for the U.S. House of Representatives seat in 1822, but will lose both elections. In 1824, he'll be elected to the United States Senate for Ohio, and in 1828, he'll be appointed as the Minister of Plenipotentiary, which is essentially an ambassador to Gran Colombia by President John Quincy Adams. By all accounts, he was awful at this job. Nobody liked him in Gran Colombia. He opposes Simón Bolívar, who is the founder of Gran Colombia. His nickname is the George Washington of South America, and he is fighting with this guy. He is opposing his political ideals. He refuses to be neutral in these political affairs, which as an ambassador, that's his role. He's not there to be politically involved. He's there to be an ambassador of goodwill for the United States, and he's fighting with the founder of the nation. He's just generally seen as this snob and an unlikable person. He's living up to the stereotype of being the loud American. So, when Andrew Jackson is elected president in 1829, he will be recalled. William Henry Harrison will come back home to the United States. He returns back to his farm in Ohio as a poor farmer and no political future. He will choose to work a smaller job as the clerk of courts in Hamilton County. He will also found an Episcopal church. He will befriend abolitionists, and it's even stated that perhaps he even changed his mind on slavery. He started a distillery, but then promptly closed it after he saw the effects of alcohol on his patrons. And at this point in his life, it almost kind of becomes a joke that he's working these small, odd jobs on the frontier of America, but unbeknownst to him, in Washington, D.C., there are people talking about making him a presidential candidate. In 1836, the Whig Party will select 4 regional candidates to run for president: Daniel Webster, Hugh Lawson White, Willie P. Magnum, and William Henry Harrison. Surely, one of their candidates would be strong enough to win the election. But they're running up against Martin Van Buren, Andrew Jackson's vice president and chosen successor. And Van Buren easily wins this election. He wins 50.8% of the popular vote and 170 electoral votes. However, Harrison had a really strong showing as the most popular Whig candidate. He wins 36.6% of the popular vote and 73 elector votes. That's not a bad showing at all for a first-time presidential candidate. In fact, if he had won Pennsylvania, he would have won 30 elector votes. So that would have put him at 103 elector votes, and Van Buren, who won Pennsylvania, would have been only at 140 elector votes. At that time in the United States, a president needed 148 elector votes to win the presidency. So Van Buren would have been underneath that magic number. The presidency would have fallen to the House of Representatives. So Harrison really wasn't that far off, and he's really encouraged by these results. So he will run again for president in 1840, this time as the sole candidate of the Whig Party. The Whigs are going to lean heavy on Harrison being a war hero and this grizzled frontier persona. They're going to label Van Buren as Van Ruin, an out-of-touch East Coast aristocrat. Harrison's campaign is going to look like a festival. It's filled with songs and alcohol and miniature log cabin souvenirs being passed out. He represents the backbone of America, the frontiersman. His slogan is Tippecanoe and Tyler too, for his battle at Tippecanoe and his chosen vice president, John Tyler. And while Van Buren is trying to campaign on logic and sensibility, Harrison campaigns on heart and emotions. Van Buren wants to talk about the hard issues. He wants to debate William Henry Harrison. But Harrison avoids speaking on anything intellectual. In fact, his advisors say that he is on a no comment policy. The Democrats are going to mock him. They will call him General Mum because he refuses to talk about anything. But the campaign works. Harrison's campaign works. Voter turnout will increase from 60% to 80%. Still one of the largest voter turnouts in United States history. And Harrison wins in a landslide. 234 elector votes to 60. Even though the elector votes looks like a landslide because it was, the popular vote was much closer. Harrison only won 52.9% of the popular vote, and Van Buren 46.8%. So the popular vote was much, much closer than the elector vote was. At the time of the election, Harrison was the oldest to ever be elected president at the age of 67. And on February 9th, 1841, Harrison will arrive to Washington, D.C. by train, becoming the first president-elect to ever do that. It also just so happened to be his birthday. He chose to arrive almost a month early to consult with his cabinet to prepare for this transition, hoping to kind of ease his way into the office of president. However, he found his life to be far less private than he thought it would be. He was constantly swarmed by people looking for jobs in the White House, asking for favors. The famous story talks about how Harrison was a regular in the market. He would go shopping for himself because the office of president wasn't as tightly protected as it is today. And as he would go shopping, people would just mob him, asking him for favors, asking him for jobs, asking him to do this or that as the president of the United States. And he took it graciously, but it was also very overwhelming for him. On a cold and rainy day on March 4th, 1841, William Henry Harrison will be inaugurated as President of the United States of America. He rides down Penn Avenue in front of a large and excited crowd despite that weather on a white horse without wearing an overcoat, a hat, or gloves. And even though he wasn't dressed appropriately for the weather, Harrison still gives the longest inauguration speech ever. He takes nearly 2 hours and gives a speech of 8,445 words. Unfortunately, later that month, Harrison falls ill from what doctors believe to be a pneumonia. And without enough time to establish his cabinet or really any policy, William Henry Harrison passes away on April 4th, 1841. He was president for 30 days, 12 hours, and 30 minutes. And although doctors at the time believe Harrison died of a pneumonia, new evidence suggests he may have actually died of septic shock. Sewage waste used to be dumped upriver from the White House, meaning that Harrison may have drank contaminated water and he fell ill from it. Although his presidency was short, Harrison still did some cool things. He appointed Daniel Webster as Secretary of State, who will help annex Texas into the United States. He's also going to stand tall and independent as the president, refusing any outside influence or lobbyist. When Henry Clay, the boss of the Whig Party, tried to play puppet master and make decisions for the president, Harrison shut it down. Clay went as far as to even dictating a letter and then asking Harrison to sign it. Harrison says, quote, "Mr. Clay, you forget I am president," end quote. The result of Harrison standing strong and rebuking Clay, Henry Clay leaves the White House. He leaves Washington, D.C. He doesn't stick around anymore because he doesn't have the influence he thinks he might have. And whether it's from hurt feelings because Harrison and Clay were actually good friends, or because Clay realized that he might have better luck back home winning political favor. I don't know. But he leaves. And this signals that Harrison really planned to be a strong and independent leader of the nation. And it really would have been fascinating to see what he might have been able to accomplish and what goals he might have had. We do know that he wanted to be an independent president. We do know that he also wanted to limit the powers of the president. 4 years earlier, Andrew Jackson was president of the United States, and his common criticism was that he acted like a king, that he used too much power. Andrew Jackson ignored the Supreme Court, ignored Congress, and Harrison wanted to pull back the power of the presidency. He especially wanted to unite the nation under our revolutionary ideals. So he largely ignores the looming issue of slavery and ignores manifest destiny in favor of promoting the idea of unity. The biggest achievement of Harrison's presidency, though, is something he didn't actually intend to do. It's Article 2, Section 1, Clause 6 of the Constitution. Because no sitting president had ever died in office, there was a lot of questions about who would take over after Harrison's death. It was clear that Vice President John Tyler would temporarily act as president, but it was not decided who would be the next permanent president. Secretary of State Daniel Webster sent a message to John Tyler, who was visiting family at the time in Virginia, to return to Washington, D.C. due to the president's death. In his letter, he refers to Tyler simply as Vice President. Webster and the cabinet believed that Tyler would act as temporary president until they could debate and decide who would take over permanently. They even discussed the possibility of another election. John Tyler, on the other hand, had other ideas. On April 6, he arrived back in Washington, D.C. early in the morning. After meeting with the cabinet, who made it clear he was only acting president, Tyler summons Judge William Cranch in the afternoon and takes the oath of office before the cabinet. The very next day, Tyler moves into the White House, and on April 9th, he addresses the American people as the President of the United States. Many people are not happy with this. Newspapers are going to call him His Excellency. People will send mail addressed to Tyler as acting president, in which he will then return it to sender until he is addressed as president. Many of his cabinet members will just resign, and there will actually be protests on the streets. So Tyler taking the oath of office wasn't exactly a popular move. But by taking the oath of office, John Tyler creates what we will call the Tyler precedent. A special session of Congress will be called on May 31st, and they have no choice but to confirm him as President of the United States. He took the oath of office. He is now President of the United States. Many will argue that he should be titled Vice President acting as President, but that didn't get very far just due to the legality of when he signs bills into law. He needs to be President of the United States. So the Tyler precedent becomes a thing. John Tyler is now President of the United States. And we see the Tyler precedent on 7 more occasions in the United States. Zachary Taylor will die of stomach disease, and his vice president, Millard Fillmore, will become president. Abraham Lincoln will be assassinated, and Andrew Johnson will become president. James Garfield will be assassinated, and Chester Arthur will become president. William McKinley will be assassinated, and Teddy Roosevelt will become president. Warren Harding will pass away of a heart attack, and Calvin Coolidge will become president. And John F. Kennedy will be assassinated, and Lyndon B. Johnson will become president. Finally, in 1967, Congress will ratify Section 1 of the 25th Amendment to declare the line of succession. So the Tyler precedent is no longer a rule to follow, it is now a law. William Henry Harrison is an interesting footnote in history. He's incredibly important in many ways, yet when asked to name all 47 presidents of the United States, I have a feeling that many would pass over his name. Harrison was involved in many crucial moments that shaped America, even current events today. He fought in the War of 1812, scored a major victory, especially in a time when the United States needed to prove that they could stand toe-to-toe with major world powers. Harrison played a crucial role in shaping the West. He stole land and killed indigenous populations all in the name of manifest destiny, believing he was acting as the protectors of the frontiersmen, who, more often than not, were provoking the indigenous population into fighting for their own sovereign rights. Moments that still matter today because treaties still matter today. And still, the most influential accomplishment of William Henry Harrison was what happened after his death. How a precedent was set for the United States government in the case that the duly elected president cannot finish their term. Sure, he had no say in legislation, but had he not been so immensely popular in 1840, Martin Van Buren could have just as likely been the president. The course of history would have gone down another winding road than the one we see today. Still, Harrison participated in one of the first ever modern presidential candidates. He used catchy slogans, handed out free souvenirs, and even alcohol. He danced around the difficult questions as many politicians do today. Although it is the chaos of his death that we most remember, for many, Harrison is one of the greatest what-ifs. What if he had served 4 years as the strong and independent president we think he might have been? Where would we be today? Thanks for listening, everybody. If you could, please like, comment, and subscribe to my channel. You can also find me on Instagram. I'd love for you to follow me there. If you'd like to email me, my email is hobbyteaching@gmail.com. We're all teachers in this world, and I would love to hear and learn from you as well. Tune in next week as I teach a lesson on humanity over ideology, where we explore bravery in World War II as American GIs and Nazi soldiers combined forces to save vulnerable people and animals. See you in the next one.